The do that out of the way. The the chapter is called "A Wandering House for Wandering People," and the little poem up there. You may not be familiar with the poem, but I'm sure you're probably familiar with the second line of the poem because you see that on the back of Jeeps and cars, and you know, not all who wander are lost. It's actually from the Fellowship of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. He is writing his friend Frodo, Gandalf is, to give him a hint about what's coming in the future. And there's another stanza to this poem that explains that Aragorn is going to come back from Middle Earth and going to recreate the kingdom. Uh, but it's that not all those who wander are lost. And I was pondering that one time, and we were talking about the people in Exodus. I said, well, some people wander just because they're lost. Some people actually wander with purpose and move on through that. And so that's where we're heading. We're wandering with a purpose on there. The journey is now about to take a major shift in almost a triad fashion. Um, all these people who were just family clans are about to shift into a singular nation, at least bonded together that way. Uh, a people who basically lived law according to their standards, their own personal standards, to a session where they have to live by structure and things are moved through. And then finally, we move from God in space to a space for God. So we make those. Uh, we sometimes forget that when the people moved into Egypt, 70 total. You remember the stories of Joseph being taken down there and the troubles that he had, but yet at the end, he's the second most powerful man in all of Egypt, creating this. During the famine of it all, Pharaoh told Joseph to bring his family over from that Cana area and bring them in as honored guests, and they were given the land of Goshen, a place where they could herd their sheep and raise their livestock. Uh, 66 came from home. You had four in the family of Joseph, so that's where you always hear this number. We start out with 70. And then in what some say maybe as long as 400 years, that 70 multiplies and multiplies and multiplies to what might be as many as a million. You see all sorts of lists in Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy about the counts, and many times the counts, which can be as high as 600,000, are only the count of men who are strong enough to go into battle. It doesn't count women and children, so that's where the numbers get extremely large. But they come in together as a family, and they don't have a guidebook. They don't have a Bible. They have no law and order. All these people have are the stories that they have heard about Abraham and all the things of him, Isaac and Jacob. That's the stories that bond these people together, and all they know is that these are 12 bands of brothers that now come together to form a unified clan. And so we're moving through that, and it had reached a point where even in Judges, it made a comment one time that all the people did what was right in their own eyes. Come on. So that means they just kind of pick it up and go with it and move from there. So they're now moving into almost a culture sort of feature, uh, getting through that. And I think it's interesting that at this point in time, they really don't even know God's name. Uh, Abraham gave him a name of sorts, but God has not formally introduced God's self to these people. Um, that expands in Exodus as we begin to see a people who worship God and meet God on the road and in the dark places and other things. Uh, Genesis 46 recalls All the persons belonging to Jacob who came into Egypt were 66 in number, and the total of Jacob's household who came to Egypt was 70 persons. And so 400 years later, we see this massive group of people. For some reason, we compress time, and uh, because of the width of things, chances we always think of they came into Egypt and suddenly they became slaves and put to hard labor, but they were there for years upon years upon years before all that came to be. That that didn't come in until the last Pharaoh, or when Moses is on the scene. Ramses is deciding to build all these new his new city with all of his new buildings. He needs manpower, so he's the one that says, "Okay, we're going to take these people and put them to work," and then basically he just enslaves them all. So it's later in that 400-year period. Prior to that, early on especially, they were treated as honored guests, even though they carried with them the term alien. Uh, so as they come out uh, and begin to meet God, uh, and Moses goes up and goes to the mountain, he's given the law. Uh, it moves them into some sense of organization and cultural shift. Uh, Now they have rules. Now they have concepts. Uh, we hear Moses, or we sense Moses going up to the mountain to talk to God, and you almost feel like he comes back with two tablets in his hand and a scroll of law stuck in his back pocket. Uh, One thing we have to kind of grasp too is that Moses is not an ignorant individual. He's not a shepherd. This man was raised in the palace. He was raised as a son of Pharaoh. He's educated. He can read. He understands. He comprehends these things. It could have very well been that when he went up there, God gave him a scroll and said, "Okay, now that you're here, take this down," and wrote out some of those things. It's not beyond understanding or comprehension that he could actually do that. Uh, Part of what happens though when he comes down and he has the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue, the 10 statements or 10 words, and then the other laws that go with it, it turns the people from a people who kind of did everything that was right within their own eyes, trying to fellowship with each other, into a people who would point toward the law and say, "See, you can't do that." And so the struggle began. Uh, and so one of the things that happened when he comes off that mountain is that now God wants to be in the midst of the people. There is an introduction. You know, Moses has already met God. He met him on that mountainside with that burning bush event. Uh, and that was one of the things that Moses asked him. If I go down there and tell these people God said, "Come on out," what's God's name? Tell me your name so I can tell them your name. That's a dangerous thing because those cultures felt like if they knew the name of a God, they had a little edge on the God because they could call that God by name. And remember what God told Moses? He didn't give a name. He said, "I am who I am. Just trust me." And so now there is a place for this I am, this Yahweh God, uh, to communicate with the people. And it's called a tabernacle. It's a mobile place for these people to move through. And when we go through the description of what these things are, we're going to say, where did they get all that stuff? Where did they get the gold? Where did they get the silver? How do these shepherd slave people get the expertise to weave fine linen and garments and things? They got it from the Egyptians. They probably learned the craft of weaving while they were there. Probably some of it brought from where they were and then refined while in Egypt. And then after that final plague, if you'll remember, of the death of the firstborn, uh, the Egyptians ran them out of town. And in the process of that, they were instructed to go to those people in Egypt and ask them for things. And so they asked them for their gold and for their silver and for their fabrics. And it said that the Egyptians gladly gave them whatever they wanted. And so, in essence, the Israelites plundered Egypt on their way out. And so now they're carting all this stuff around in the wilderness. And so they have all this to work from. So we're going to take a walk around what this concept of tabernacle is all about. Um, this is the floor plan of something, and it's not huge. That's one of our misconceptions. The footprint, the outer walls are about 150 by 75. That's not a large place. It's not large enough to handle maybe close to 1 million people. That's not a place large enough to even handle one of the clans. So it's not a place for people to come and gather and sit down and worship. There's another purpose for this all along. So as they move through this, we see the outside edge is a curtain of linen. It's a wall 7.5 feet tall. They're made of stays so that they can just roll it up, pack it up, and take it on the road the next time they make their move toward the Holy Land, the Promised Land. It's all linen except for the front wall, and the front wall has 3 different colors. It's made out of a fine twisted linen, and the 3 woven is blue, purple, and scarlet. So these are fine colors that we're looking at as they move through and gain on each side. Uh, so all of the outside itself is a fabric just held up by a post and then entered in on that front side. Uh, Inside, you have some very specific appointments. Almost like when we walk into our sanctuary, we look up at our sanctuary, and the first thing we see the pulpit and the lectern and the choir loft. Then you look further back and you see the communion table with the cross and those types of things. The same type of thing. The first thing you notice is this great big bronze box uh, that is built as an altar. It's a place of sacrifice for these people. Uh, and sacrifices are generally not corporate, not at this time. Uh, all the people don't gather around and huddle around the tabernacle in order for somebody to do an offering. It's a personal thing. If you have something to be happy about, you bring an offering. If you're struggling with something, you bring an offering. And many times it can be fruits or vegetables or animals, and it is placed on this altar and burned. Although not all the sacrifices are burned to a crisp, really just a few are. If you brought a lamb to be slaughtered to ask forgiveness for something maybe you have done, they would slaughter the lamb, and the loss of the blood was the real redemptive factor in it, because that was the life of that animal poured out on that altar. Then they would do what we would term as field dress the lamb, take all the entrails out. That's what was really burned. And then most often the rest of the animal was split in half. The man or person who brought the sacrifice would be given half. The other half would be given to the priest so they could have food to eat. And so they would move that. It was kept burning all the time that it was stable. And it was the first thing you ran into once you entered that door. The next thing that you run into is a big washing basin called a laver. Uh, and this is the beginning of an understanding that every time you come into the presence of the holy, you have to make yourself clean enough to be a part of that holy. We find it here. We find it when the temple comes. We hear of the washing pools when Jesus was here. You would walk in, you'd bathe yourself and go. It was not a matter of taking a bath. It was a matter of ritually cleansing yourself to be presentable to God. So after the slaughter of these animals and other things, this labor was a place for them to clean themselves uh, after making offerings and sacrifices. Uh, and so you have this outside tent that then moves toward a smaller inner tent. And that inner tent is the residence of God. It is elaborate, to say the least. It's only 15 feet wide, 45 feet long. Uh, and the only people who can go inside that tent are the priest. Now, I may have missed a cue back there, but when God starts setting all this up, God picks a group of one of the tribes and says, "You're going to be the ones who will be the priest of all these people," and that's the Levites. The reason he picked them, most likely, is because when Moses came down with the Ten Commandments and he saw that golden calf that they had made, it was the tribe of Levi who backed Moses in the destruction of that. And so, with that action with Moses, they have now kind of put themselves in this position of being a priest. I'll explain about their task later, but they're the only ones who can come into this. Uh, 15 feet wide, 45 feet long is the holy place. It has an outer tent, outer space, a holy place, and then on the inside it has the Holy of Holies uh, that's only entered once a year, usually, uh, by the high priest. The materials to create this sacred space are silver and gold, copper, blue, purple fabrics, crimson fabrics, fine linen, and various hides. Uh, the outside walls of this structure is actually wood, Arcadia wood, which is a wood that's found there, and it turns very dark. I picture it almost like a dark walnut or a mahogany that after age, it really mellows out. So what they did there, they then overlaid it with gold, so it would shine. It's not so much about uh, the expense or the showing the costliness of the gold. It's a reflective agent. It's what bounces the light around. It's what brings it to the attention of what's going on. Uh, Only the finest materials are used. The tent of meeting, that's the outside part, is 15 by 30. The inside part is the smaller one. And on the inside of that front part, you have a menorah. That's that lampstand. Uh, it has what it usually got. It said it's got 6 lights, but it really has 7. It has 6 candles that branch out, and then the center stalk goes higher, and that makes the 7th one. So it's a 7 flame candlestick, and it's supposed to be burning all the time. Uh, Next to that, close to that, is a table of incense. Incense is that pleasant smell, the rise of incense. They say if the incense smoke as it rises, it carries the prayers up to God. Uh, Orthodox churches still do that. They burn incense. They take the censers and they'll walk through as people pray, wanting those prayers to be carried up. And then there's also a table of what is termed showbread. These are little cakes, and there's 12 of them representing the 12 tribes of Israel. They bring them in on one day. They stay there for a week. Then they take them out and put fresh bread in, and then that bread is then given to the priests that are working. So it gives you this whole new concept of day old bread. You know, I can just imagine this stuff is really tough, but it's food. And so that's changed out in a regular base, but it's a very, very beautiful thing. And then finally, we get to steal a glimpse into the Holy of Holies. And here again, it's completely covered in gold as a reflective sense. And what is on the inside of that is just one thing, and that's the ark. Uh, in Exodus, God says, tell the people to build a chest of Arcadia wood, 45 inches long, 27 inches wide, and 27 inches high. Cover it inside and out with pure gold, and put gold edging around the lid. Make 4 gold rings, fasten one to each corner so they can make it movable, and make 2 poles of Arcadia wood and cover them with gold so that they can be put through a ring. Uh, we see these things about the Ark of the Covenant, and the pictures that we see, we've always got to see this massive chest that's sitting there. But when you think about it, that's not that big a box. 45 inches long and then 27 by 27. It's just not that big of a box. Uh, but it's put together like that. And then on the lid, again, is made out of the wood, it's covered with the gold, and all of this is overlaid. But then there are 2 cherubs on top, and those cherubs have wings that arch over, and these are not molded. It says these are to be hammered out. So they're beaten into shape out of pure gold. And as it comes over, the place where the 2 wings almost meet is said to be the place where God is. And there is not a light or a lamp inside the Holy of Holies because the presence of God's self is lighting that space. You've probably seen all these documentaries about the mysteries of the ark, about the men who touched it that fell dead. You have all these engineers telling us about how, because of the way it was constructed, it could collect static electricity and zap people and all sorts of things. But the purpose is to simply just be there. And inside that box, there are 3 things. There's a jar of manna, which they ate while they were in the wilderness. And of course, we were told that after a day that would spoil. Apparently, what they put in this jar didn't. There is the rod of Aaron, which was the rod that budded overnight and bloomed and produced almonds as he was chosen to lead. And then the 2 plates, the 2 tablets on which God gave them the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, which is said to have been carved by God's finger himself. That's what's on the inside of the box. And so as you move through all of that, now you find, and here's the sad part, or at least it is to me. When you see all these colors, when you see all that gold, when you look at all the appointments put in there, regular people never get to see it. The people from the outside, they don't get to wander through there and say, oh, isn't this a beautiful holy place? Only the certain priests get to go inside that. There are other priests that never really make it all the way to the inside. They see about the outside. And so they never get to see the beauty of what's going on. And as we talk later, we'll find out that same concept applies to the temple when it's constructed. The people just don't get to see it. But all of this together is created to be a mobile place of worship. You come there, you do your offerings, you pay homage to God all throughout the week. On the Sabbath day, you don't do anything. That is a day of rest. That is a day of recreation. That's a day when you set yourself apart because God rested on that day. So you didn't have Sunday worship. You worshiped according to when the Spirit moved you. If you felt like you needed to bring something in or say something to a priest, that's how you moved into all of this. Uh, and then the second thing that comes up beyond that is the people who run the show. And these are men from the tribe of Levi. Now, all the men from the tribe do not serve as a priest at one time. They do it in shifts. You work so many days, and then you come off, and then another group comes in, so it rotates. And really, everybody like that shifts around except for the high priest, who is designated. And so you have what we would call a select group of ordinary clergy, for our vernacular, and then you have the others. By this time, we actually have a name for God. Uh, it's the Yahweh. And like I said, in your Old Testament text, you'll see that little word Lord in all capital letters. That's the word that's behind that, Yahweh. They talk about Yahweh. They try to find out what Yahweh wants for them. And these men are supposed to be the ones who try to help them figure that out. Uh, and just like so many other things, even today, what really makes the priest is the clothes. You often heard people say, well, it's the clothes that make the man or the woman. You know, if you dress up for business or if you do other things. Uh, Policemen are policemen because of the uniform they wear. Well, the priest are the priest because of the uniform they wear. And when they wear it, they are special people. They are elite people. When their task is over, they take off that robe and they're just Mr. Joe again until the next time they have to serve. The ones who do the work, the regular priest, uh, have a three-part garment, uh, um, or four. One is a tunic, a white uh, garment that goes from shoulder all the way down to your feet, that is made of linen. You have a linen belt that ties it around. You have a turban. And then the fourth piece is a new introduction, underwear. There is a place where God instructs where all the uh, the places of sacrifice, the altars, have to be ground level because they don't want the priest going up to offer a sacrifice and people seeing up the skirt. And so God solves that problem. He gives you boxer briefs to slide on these things. And so that is a very simplistic uh, identity of these people. There's no mention of shoes. So we assume that all the work by a priest was done barefooted. And one thing that we know is that with these men wearing these white robes and they're sacrificing animals, they're going to get dirty. But you can't wash that garment. When it gets sold, you're to take it out, it gets destroyed, apparently, and then you get a new robe. For some ladies, I'm sure that's occupational guarantees. You know, you've got job security because if you can make the priest garments, you're in good shape because those things are going to be on rotation quite often. Uh, so they're very simplistic, but they are identifiable. You know who they are. You know the task that they have, and then comes the high priest, which is much more elaborate. Uh, there are seven, eight if you include the undergarments that have this. Uh, One is an ankle length tunic that goes from the shoulder all the way to the ground with long sleeves. The outer robe, the vest, is called an ephod, uh, and it is a shorter one with short sleeve. Uh, it was blue. You know, that's God's favorite color. They say, if the ocean is blue and the sky is blue, then that's got to be God's favorite color. That's what the Israelites tell you. What when you see the Star of David on the flag, what color is it? Blue. So so they assume that God's favorite color is blue. Uh, and then on top of that, you have an apron that's embroidered with purple and scarlet and golden threads. And on the bottom of that part are little golden bells. Uh, there is a part of the mission that says that the reason they put the bells on it so that you couldn't sneak up on God. But there are writings that tell us, especially in the temple times, that when you had to go into the Holy of Holies, you had to be absolutely pure. And to do the cleaning up and the things in the Holy of Holies, what they eventually evolved into is that the priest's task was to clean up that place, would have a rope tied around their waist. And when they would walk in, and as they were doing their task, you could hear the jingling of these bells. And if the bells stopped jingling, there was trouble. And so it was a task to pull him out. We have no record of any of that happening, but that was the task. But that at the bottom in the palm of the hand, you can see how small that is. Uh, it's probably been 10 or 12 years ago now. Doing some work right close to the temple, they actually uncovered what they think is a bell off of a priest's garment, a tiny little bell. So you have those. Uh, on the top of that, well, in fact, uh, let me throw a New Testament story in on this. You remember the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth, John the Baptist's parents? You know, it falls his lot to go into the holy place and make sure everything was right. And it always has made me wonder that if he had that rope around him and he goes in there and there's the little jingling of the bell, what happened when that angel shows up? I'd have thought those bells would have gone crazy. And they would say, something's really happening in here. And of course, then he comes out and can't talk. So that's kind of a twist on some of that. One of the unique things that we don't often really search for is the hidden pocket in that breastplate that has 12 stones, 4 rows representing the 12 tribes, that's put on by straps of onyx, again with 6 on each side. And then underneath that, apparently, or in the side of it, is a little pocket that holds 2 rocks. Uh, what we would basically say would be dice. It's the Urim and the Thummim. And this is the way of answering questions. If someone was struggling with something in life that was a major issue and they just simply could not come to a resolve, they would come to the high priest and explain to them the situation, and the high priest would reach into that little pocket and get out these 2 stones and basically cast lots. And it gives 3 answers. That's the way the stones could fall. Yes, no, and wait. And there is no second chance. You can't say, well, that's not, let's throw them another, let's get 2 out of 3. No, one shot is it. You throw it, whatever the answer is, you have to accept. Uh, we even say that sometimes about the way we pray. You know, we pray, we say, well, maybe our prayers aren't being answered. Well, maybe they are. Maybe God said yes to your prayer. Maybe God said no to your prayer. Maybe God said, why don't you wait? And he said, that's the one we have trouble with. we can handle the other 2. It's the one that said, hey, let's wait. And then we know what's going on. Uh, so we have that. And then, of course, the very ending of this is he has a 2-part turban on top that he has. It has a gold band around it that has an inscription that says, Holy unto the Lord. Um, in daily use, we find that the tabernacle was a busy place, people bringing sacrifices, talking to the priest, uh, finding a place where they can kind of unburden themselves or share a joy. It was not a stagnant place at all, 6 days a week. Uh, so they have that. Uh, we talked about how small it was, uh, and also the priests that work here are not preachers. You don't stop in the middle of the day and say, "Now we're going to let Joe, Mr. Priest Joe, give you a good word." That doesn't happen. You hear the word of God from those who've been picked out special that we eventually call prophets, who are to proclaim the word of God because of a special calling. These people have a function of doing the work within the tabernacle and moved through that. Uh, this tabernacle sojourned with them for the 40 years. When I was at Oxford, I haven't and still have contact with a very special man by the name of Rabbi Norman Solomon. When I was doing my studies there, he was head of Jewish studies and uh, and is a premier leader in Judeo-Christian relations on how the Jewish people and the Christian people can get along together and support each other and help each other. And uh, and so he talks about the way we move through this 40-year period. And what he said in the Jewish concept that the reason we say it took 40 years, he said it took that long to purify the people from all the ills that they learned in Egypt. It took that long. And of course, we also understand that part of that came out, especially after the spy story, is this one generation had to leave. You impact that with what is called Jewish numerology, which means they don't really care about the count. Numbers are symbolic. When someone says that Moses went up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, nobody was counting. It is the symbolic language for he was there for a very long time. Same thing about the flood story. The flood story rained 40 days and 40 nights. Well, nobody was watching the calendar because they didn't have one. They just know that it rained for an extremely long time. And so when we talk about the wilderness, they could have wandered 20 years. They could have wandered 80 years, but they wandered the right amount of time for God to do the work that had to be done. But it was a very long time. And so you moved through that. The ark, we hear when they come into the promised land as they cross the river, how the river split and they took the ark of the covenant across. But we never hear the story of, uh, and right behind the ark came 200 people carrying all the stuff from the tabernacle. They just all came across. Uh, the Jewish people weren't really caught up in particulars. They just assumed a lot, and they assumed that you know a lot. So it just happened. So they cross into the promised land. One of the first things they do is they divide up territories for each family clan, and then the tabernacle itself comes to rest at a place called Shiloh. In Joshua, it says, Then the whole congregation of Israelites assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting. The land laid subdued before them. Everybody was at rest. Uh, the Mishnah, which is uh, commentary on the Jewish writings, uh, said that when they finally established the tabernacle here, really one of the first things they did is they did away with the wooden walls and they created stone walls. And um, but after they created the stone walls and then did the same thing, made sure that they had the gold and everything on the inside, the top of it remained animal hide, the same covering that it had in the wilderness. And so the people began to come to this place. And I had mentioned last week about the thought of, and say even for the state of Alabama to only have one church. And if you wanted to come into the presence of God, according to the way you felt then, you had to travel all that way just to go to that one place. They did not have little churches everywhere. They did not have priests scattered all over the place. This was a singular corporate place that stood there, and it survived in that place for 369 years. We hear uh, one of the stories that we hear about this most often is the lady that's Hannah, who did not have a child and who was begging for a son, someone to give her fulfillment. And she's standing at the door of the tabernacle praying to God. And that's when the promise of Samuel comes in. So it was there, and it eventually we hear that sad, sad statement where it says that the priest had forgotten the sacredness of their calling and did evil things. And because of the evil things they did, some died and others just perverted the people in the way that they thought. So, as a way of kind of wrapping all this up, uh, we kind of make a walking tour, so to speak, of what's going on. Uh, we do know, for one thing, that it is a place of worship that stood in the middle of the community. When it was in the wilderness, where the tabernacle sat, all the tribes were given a specific location around it. And wherever they moved it and they stopped, those camps stayed in that place. So it stood there in the center intentionally. Um, and here at Shiloh, one of the things that happened was it was shifted away from all those because the people scattered. And so now it's not necessarily in the center, but it is still the place where the act of worship was carried out, primarily on an individual base. Uh, Secondly, we understand that those who led worship were intentionally separated from the ordinary people, what we now call laity. We recognize that by the clothes they wore, and that even happens today. We talk about coming to church in our Sunday best and how we do these things, and and especially in the earlier days of of the contemporary movement in worship, uh, people would complain because a preacher would get up in these contemporary services in their blue jeans and their golf shirt and and preach, and that wasn't the right thing to do. And the pastor many times would say, "Well, I do this because I want to be one of you. I want you to see me as one of you." That ain't happening. The preacher's the preacher. We look at the preacher as the preacher, and whatever he does, he's not just one of us. He's a called individual to do a task. Years ago, I was pastoring a church in North Birmingham, and we went to a Friday night high school football game with some of the members of the church. And we sat about halfway up in the bleachers, and these were two rivals that fought tooth and toenail. And of course, all the people around me were doing this screaming and hollering and calling the ref everything except good because it didn't go with the way they wanted it to happen. And it just went on and on and on and on. During halftime, just before the game started back in the second half, somebody walked down the front of the bleachers and looked up and waved at me and said, "Hello, preacher." You wouldn't believe how it changed around me. Not because of me, but because of the station that I had. That's the same thing that would happen here. That there is something about the calling of someone to do God's work, whether they want to admit it or not, they are special because they have a special task that not everybody can do. Um, and finally, there's the worship place. And for them, there was no sense of corporate worship. They did not gather together for a sunrise service or the first day of the year. That finally came later. The one thing that they did have that bound them together was a family ceremony called the Passover. It was not done in the tabernacle. It was not done in a holy place. It was done at home with family. And if you didn't have a family would bring you in and you would gather together on that sacred night to do one thing: remember who we are. That's basically what we do on Easter when we gather for Easter. And that's why all these people come out of the woodwork and show up at Easter. Not because of an event, but it's because of the story that binds us all together. I had a professor when I was at Emory who went to a big church in Nashville on a Christmas Eve. And he said he was kind of sitting in the balcony with the pastor before the service, and he saw all these people. He said there were homeless people off the streets, people of all ages and races and mixtures, all piling in. And he said to the pastor, "Isn't it marvelous that your church is open enough to come in and hear this story for the first time about Jesus' birth?" And he looked at him and he said, "Don't you get it? They're not coming here to hear the story for the first time. They're coming here because they know the story and they want to hear it again." And that's what the Seder was. They gathered around that place so that they could hear the story again. So that brings us to some of our questions. And this is a part of it that we're not going to belabor. If you have a comment about it, it's really more of a reflective time. God instructed Moses to construct the tabernacle to house God's presence. Uh, how do you respond to the law stating that the tabernacle is to be entered only by men and not by the entire community? It was the culture of the day. It was culture. Women were other. Property. And children really too. No, they were property. Until they went to their bar mitzvah, so to speak. And so it seems odd. And even as we read through the whole Bible, we find that cultural thing floats through. In the instructions God provided for worship, the tribe of Levi held the responsibility to be priest. And they were priests because they were born into a family lineage of priests. We don't do that anymore. We have ministers who sense a call into doing that. In fact, that's what happens in the Jewish community now. After Jerusalem was sacked in 70, the whole concept of priesthood disappeared. And so rabbis are basically called to be a rabbi. They're not family lineage. I know when I was going through ordination and you had to meet with committee, I don't know, 3 and 4 times a year, so they'd kind of make sure that you were who you were. And they would always ask you the same question first: explain for us your calling in the ministry. You can't really do that. You can kind of say, well, it's sort of like, but for these men, they were born into it. As a child, you knew that when you grew up, this was your task. And of course, that was basically the way it was with all of culture. If your dad was a shepherd, you were going to be a shepherd. If your dad was a farmer, you were going to be a farmer. If your dad was a priest, you're going to be a priest. Uh, the high priest had the Urim and the Thummim to help him make decisions. How do we in this postmodern society discern God's will when we cannot find a clear direction? And that's a struggle. It really is. How do we know? And do we sometimes have an answer kind of pop in and then you start questioning the answer? Now, is this just something I've made up or is this really what God wants me to do? It's a struggle.
Don't we ask other believers, like we ask other believers what their thoughts on, and ask other believers to pray with us, and it always has to line with the Bible. If it doesn't line up with the Bible, maybe not the Bible. That's what I've always
Well,
said.
I don't know if this, if you're struggling with the question of it, is this the right job for me? I'm not sure that that's a biblical thing, but now if it has something to do with a spiritual question or a spiritual quest, you're probably right on that. But it's a struggle when we have those questions of where to find that.
This too, I'm wondering, was that I always thought that was in the book of Acts. I think it's in Acts when they're trying to decide who's going to, and it's Stephen ends up being the one that helps the apostles give the food to the. Isn't this the story that I'm thinking this is in? The apostles are trying to decide who's going to help them. It's become such a big task to give the food to the widows that they're trying to help. They're trying to find somebody to help. And they prayed over that and everything, and then they cast lots. And I always thought that was so odd that they cast lots.
Well, the same thing happened
Yeah.
when they had to decide on somebody to replace Judas,
Yes, yes, yes.
and they rely
Yes, Judas.
they rely on God to make things fall right.
And you think that maybe stems from this? Yeah.
God will provide the correct answer. I don't know. Maybe we ought to all bet some dice. Odd numbers, yes. Even I don't know.
I think remain is too hard, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the black one that you turn it upside down. Uh, in the age of the tabernacle, there was no designated time for the entire community to gather for worship and receive instruction. Each person did as they felt led or sensed the need. What draws people to our place of worship? What makes you want to come to our place of worship?
Fellowship, need, learning, another thing.
Right, a lot of things. Uh, in our educational sense, in our Sunday school classes and stuff, that's the whole purpose, isn't it? For us to finally find a place where we can sit down and really get deep inside things. Worship, whether it's the traditional worship or the contemporary worship, the bottom line is the same. You come to worship because you want to find a place where you can connect with God. And sometimes you connect to God through the music. Uh, Maybe you're listening to Chris play some of those gospel songs as a before the worship service starts, and it maybe sends you back to childhood or whatever, or maybe a prelude or an anthem. Maybe sometimes you connect with God because that one leading the pastoral prayer says something that really makes you connect to the Spirit of God. And yes, that's my prayer too. Once in a while, we really connect to the sermon. I think some of us talk too much about our sermon. Uh, Years ago now, when Chris was a little boy, well, he wasn't a little boy. He was already just out of high school, I think. Uh, I was in Albertville. I was already teaching, but I was doing revival services. It was really summer services for a little church right outside of Boaz. And that was Chris's home church. His, his mother and his grandmother went there. Everybody knew him. And of course, he would come in and he would sit down at the piano. And when he was going to play the special of the evening, people would call out in the congregation, "Why don't you play this song?" And of course, you know what Chris does. Off he goes. And I would often make a comment in those sessions. I said, what I like about this is good music can carry a bad sermon a long way. And we had good music. But but to me, that has always been the central focus of why we get together. It's the fellowship, it's the community, it's the process. But the bottom line of it all is, are we meeting God there? Can we step away from worship service and say, today, this is where I came into fellowship? Next week, we're going to move from this tent structure into the temple process, some of the practices in the temple and the synagogue. And that's the effort for next time.